Okay, welcome to this A-level Buddhism Religious Studies Anthology analysis of Rahula's text, The Bodhisattva Ideal in Buddhism. And this is section 4. Let's read it and then we will analyze it. At that time, there was nothing called Mahayana. Mahayana as such appeared much later, about the beginning of the Christian era. Without Mahayana, there would not be Hinayana. Buddhism that went to Sri Lanka with its Tripitaka and commentaries in the 3rd century BC remained there intact as Theravada and did not come into the scene of Hinayana-Mahayana dispute that developed later in India. It seems therefore not legitimate to include Theravada in either of these two categories. The Mahayana mainly deals with the Bodhisattvayana, or the vehicle of the Pratya Buddhayana. For example, Asanga, the founder of Yogacara system, in his magnum opus, the Yogacara Bhumisatra, devotes 2 sections to Stravacca Bhumi and Prakya Bhumi to the Bodhisattva Bhumi, which shows that all 3 yanas were given due consideration in the Mahayana. So, question 1. At what time was there nothing called Mahayana? It says, at that time. Well, what time? He's referring in particular to the time of Emperor Asoka of India, who we think may have died 230 BCE in India. The last major emperor of the Mauryan dynasty of India. His vigorous patronage of Buddhism during his reign furthered the expansion of that religion, Buddhism, throughout India. And following his successful but bloody conquest of the Kalinga country on the east coast, Asoka announced armed conquest and adopted a policy that called conquest by dharma, i.e. the principles of right life. So is Rahula a religious studies naturalist or doctrinary believer? He says there was nothing called Mahayana. Mahayana as such appeared much later. So in what mode is Rahula speaking here? So many trace the precedence of Mahayana back to the Second Council, 390 BCE, and the disputes over Vinya to do with salt. And this group who refer to themselves as the Great Party, the Mahasamgika Schism. Some think it's more recent. It's the 3rd Council of Asoka, roughly 240 BC, to the personalists who were rejected as heretics. And this is written about in what's called the Points of Controversy in the Tipitaka Abhidhamma section. Or maybe the antecedents are only about 100 BC with the first proper perfection of wisdom writing, the 8,000 verses. So Mahayana appeared much later. Well, did it? That's a claim that could be questioned, because some argue that precedence of Proto-Mahayana could be much earlier. And really Rahula is speaking as a Theravada apologist here and polemicist, not really in the objective tone of a Buddhist studies naturalist. So he's not a naturalist about Theravada in the same way. It goes back to the Buddha and leads one to Nibbana. But on Mahayana, he takes a skeptical, naturalistic, polemical tone, indicating his belief in the lack of any real or supernatural authorial origin. It's very easy to adopt critical Western studies and apply it to your competitors, Mahayana, but can you apply it to your own faith, Theravada? So when exactly is much later? When exactly is much later, and how far is Rahula being accurate? 2nd century AD, perhaps with Nagarjuna, is too late to say here is Mahayana, because the 8,000 lines, 100 BC, the 25,000 lines, the large sutra about the birth of Jesus, the Lotus Sutra about 150 AD, all could be moments when you would say here is Mahayana. And Basham would largely agree. Its institutions didn't, but he would point out its ideals were already present and becoming explicit in the 1st century BC through to the 2nd century AD perfection of wisdom literature. But this would be denied by Mahayana defenders like Nagarjuna, who would claim it's always existed, but it kind of was discovered as the more perfected truth via various kinds of religious experience, whether it's in the Lotus Sutra, the idea of the sea serpents revealing the new truth, or maybe just the Buddha appearing in the world to reveal his updated revelation, various ideas of that. So he talks here about the Christian era. All we mean by that is the traditional date of Christ's birth. But this could mean a little bit later, perhaps maybe when the death of Jesus. Certainly the word Christian doesn't come into use till about AD 45, with the Church of Antioch being called little Christs, little Jesuses, or Christians, in other words. And the Roman Empire, it really doesn't come into its own as it was. It had been called the followers of the way until the Roman Empire starts to persecute it, maybe AD 64, and maybe later still it could be considered with the beginning of Constantine's reign, 311, and his conversion shortly after, and maybe even not until the Nicene Creed, 325. So when is the Christian era? He doesn't get specific. So is Rahula right? He's about that without Mahayana there could not be Hinayana. He says without Mahayana there could not be Hinayana. Well, strictly speaking, this could be true, but it's more complex. Neither Theravada or Mahayana was really there before 200 AD, as he will claim for Theravada. And Hinayana is primarily a derogatory, polemical name, adopted, developed, probably by Mahayana in the later perfection of wisdom literature, especially the Lotus Sutra, think the Burning House Parable. Now, some modern scholars have tried to refer to pre-sectarian, maybe 1830, 36 schools, groups that emerged after the second and maybe third councils as the Hinayana, but this is not accurate. Now, you'd need to look into Natir and Williams and their comments. So is Rahula accurate that the Theravada went to Sri Lanka in the 3rd century, i.e. in Asoka's mission, and thereafter it remained intact from the 3rd century onwards? So what does he say? It's Tripitaka and commentaries, and there remained intact. Well, as mentioned, the way of the elders Buddhism that prevailed at Asoka's council was what in the main went to Sri Lanka with Asoka's mission, sort of. But even as orthodoxy was being enshrined in the Abhidharma, Section 7, Points of Controversy. It seems the wrong ideas eventually also went to Sri Lanka as well, because while people may have paid lip service, there probably were people who were silently not quite on message with all of the rejected points of controversy. So the island had its own kind of inquisition, with those who held to the Mahayana-like beliefs and practices eventually being exiled as heretics sometime around the time of Jesus, or maybe as late as the 2nd century. It just isn't so neat. What Rahula is doing here is making a claim to original authority. Ashoka sent Theravada to Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has been Theravada all the way through. And this should be critiqued. It's not as simple as he is framing it. What does he mean by the Hinayana-Mahayana dispute? So this is a framing, this is a construct by Rahula that's hugely loaded. It's a particular reading, historical reading, a biased description that neither Western scholars like Basham or Mahayana's own scholars would accept. He is suggesting that there was a sudden, sharp disagreement that led to a radical schism in the Sangha, rather than, as Basham might argue, a kind of gradual, continued kind of rumbling going on in the Sangha, council after council. Rahula is setting up the Theravada origin story much in the way as a Marvel comic might, and with the same lack of perhaps objective truth. So he says Theravada is the true inheritors of Buddhist claims and traditions. Mahayana are the emergent, radical new heretics and not the legitimate successors of Buddhism in any way, and that their views and practices were radically different from the beliefs and practices of all the Buddhist schools. However, Williams argues otherwise. Read his work. So why in India? That later developed in India. For the view that Theravada institutions in Sri Lanka were never polluted by Mahayana beliefs, and that it was only ever on the Indian mainland, is just not true. The so-called heretical beliefs that were purged from the island in what seems to be an inquisition align very well with what would become Mahayana and could be thought of as Mahayana sympathizers. And this Rahula himself will shortly actually even refer to. Is Rahula right when he claims it's not legitimate to include Theravada in either of these two categories? He says it's not legitimate to include Theravada in either of these two categories of Hinayana, Mahayana. Well, yes, Theravada is neither Hinayana or Mahayana, but neither does it predate these as some pure original Buddhism that existed without blemish or spot on the island of Sri Lanka, air-gapped like a computer from viruses on the mainland. Even the beliefs and practices would dominate the institutional choices, it's true, of the second and maybe third council. If they the Theravada would come to reflect the main choices of the proto, and you could call them proto-Theravada ideas. But it's not quite Theravada just yet. This is perhaps a term that doesn't even come into use until the 18th, 19th century. Is Rahula accurate in claiming that Mahayana mainly deals with the Bodhisattva yana? Again, this is only partly true, and it smuggles in what Basham would see as contestable assumptions. The claim that the institution of Mahayana somehow created the Bodhisattva yana, for example, Natir is critical of. Rather, the institutions that constitute the local Sangha communities had members with diverse beliefs and practices, some of which were following the Bodhisattva Yana. And Williams would argue living largely peaceably and in unity with others until they were abruptly, as it seems, kicked out after some top-down inquisition. What was the vehicle of the Prakyana Buddha? Well, this is a more complex term. If we go to Boswell's Harvard Encyclopedia, his Dictionary of Buddhism, in Sanskrit, the Prakyana vehicle is one of three vehicles: the Triyana, along with the Stravacca Yana, and the Bodhisattva Yana. So later Mahayana sutras and treatises, we'll come to those in a second, classify the Prakyana Buddhayana as a form of Hinayana, like the Stravacca Yana, the path of the Prakya Buddha. It culminates in achieving the enlightenment of the Arhat, although according to the later sources we'll look at in a minute, the path of the Prakya Buddha takes longer because it must master the path on his own without instructions from a Buddha in his final lifetime. In the text, the Abhisamayakara, Prakya Buddhas are said to eliminate the misconception of objects, but to be unable to eliminate the misconception of the subject. That's key in the Yogacara text, saying they don't get it. They really don't get it. They still are quite realist about knowledge. The mind-only thinking of Yogacara and the text here rejects the aim of the Prakya Buddha. So Asanga, who was he, and what was the Yogacara 3rd, 4th century system? So Asanga is regarded with his brother Vasubandhu as the founder of Yogacara tradition of Mahayana philosophy, perhaps the tradition that births this mind-only sort of idealism or philosophy. His biography reports that he was born in Purasapara in India and converted to Mahayana from the Hinayana, later convincing his brother Vasubandhu to make the same move, and together they systematized and created teachings of Yogacara, authoring the main Yogacara commentaries and treatises. His key idealist. Now, what's idealism? Idealism is the belief that it's all about ideas, which are in the mind, in psychology, and it's the mind that interprets reality. Everything outside of the subject, just thought about that, the subject is not real. Everything's subjective. So the mind constructs its world, but this is an application of emptiness or sunyata, leads us away from Theravada and its naive realism, the notion of what they will call the storehouse consciousness or the pure mind. This is we're getting to not quite Buddha nature, but because that's the Tathagata Garbha Sutra. But it's this idea of luminous mind. There is a consciousness that we all have to realize. What about Asanga? Does Rahula think Asanga's magnum opus is really not that impressive, not that good? Or is Rahula being disingenuous, awarding such a superlative to a Mahayana text? He says, for example, Asanga, the founder of Yogacara Kura system, in his magnum opus, in italics, the Yogacara Bhumisatra, Rahula here likes to pretend to be the Western scholar when he's dealing with his other traditions than his own. But he's disingenuously really just blowing hot air because he's about to twist. So he's elevating the text and its author because that's what you do. If you have an authorial source, that then is more persuasive than logic. But he's only establishing it as an authorial source to abuse it, to misuse it, to support his contradicting viewpoint. So for Asanga, he's going to appropriate Asanga's Mahayana Yogacara text to justify his Theravada anti-Mahayana polemic. So here's a question. Was Asanga's magnum opus really the Yogacara Bhumisatra? Now, Boswell, again in his encyclopedia and dictionary, says in Sanskrit it means the treatise on the stages of yogic practice. It's an encyclopedic work that is the main treatise or sastra of Yogacara school of Indian Buddhism. It's widely influential in East Asia and Tibet, being translated into Chinese in the 7th century and into Tibet in the 9th century. Authorship is traditionally ascribed to Asanga or in China to Maitreya, but the size and scope of the text suggests that it was the compilation of the work of a number of scholars, possibly including Asanga, during the 4th century. The work is divided into 5 sections. It's a huge text. The first and longest, comprising approximately of half the text, is called the Multiple Stages, the Bahai Bhumika or Bhumisvastra, and sets forth the stages of the path to Buddhahood in 17 subsections. Wow. The 2 most famous of these sections, both of which are preserved in the Sanskrit, which are circulated as independent works, are the Stravacca Bhumi and the Bodhisattva Bhumi, the later providing one of the most detailed discussions of the Bodhisattva path, the Marga in Indian literature. In this last section about the Bodhisattva Bhumi, the path of the Bodhisattva, any of the central doctrines of Yogacara school are discussed, including the idea of the 8 consciousness, the Ala Vinya, or the 3 natures, the Tri-Vibhava, and the structures and practices of the Stravacca, boo, hiss, they're no good. Prakya Buddha, well, that's pointless, that's selfish. And the hooray Bodhisattva are presented here in the form that would eventually become normative amongst Mahayana scholars and scholastics in the general, not just adherents of Yogacara. Now, the second section of this text, the Compendium of Resolving Questions, considers controversial points that arise. And the third section, a Compendium of Interpretation, examines these points in the light of relevant passages from the sutras. And it's really interesting to note that the majority of the texts cited in this section are Sanskrit agmas rather than Mahayana sutras. The fourth section of this large text, called the Compendium of Synonyms, and considers mentioning and considers the terms. It's like the glossary. The fifth and final section, the Compendium of Topics, considers the central points of Buddhist doctrine. The Pratya Samapada and Bodhi. And this section also contains a discussion of Vinya, in the Chinese version, Abhidharma. So it's a critique of maybe the Theravada texts of the Tipitaka. So if we go back to that first section that deals with the idea of the Stravacca Bhumi. So there are lots of stages. Stage 850 of the Stramanara, of the listener, or the stage of the disciple, is a work included by Asanga in the first section of his text of multiple stages. The work considered sometimes as a separate and independent text because it's so important, deals with the practice associated with the Stravacca, the disciples, the one who listens. And it has 4 sections, which deals with spiritual lineage, the different types of people, the preparation for practice, the mundane practice, and the super mundane practice of the Stravacca Bhumi. So the first yoga sthana of the spiritual lineage is divided in 4 parts. The first, the stage of lineage, discusses the spiritual potentiality or lineage of the Stravacca from the 4 standpoints: its intrinsic nature, its establishment or definition, the marks characterizing the persons belonging to that lineage, and the classes of people in that lineage. Remember, this is to reject it in the end. Secondly, the stages of entrance, discussed the stage where the disciples enters upon the practice. And like the previous part, this section treats the issue from the same 4 standpoints. Third stage of deliverance explains the stage where the disciple, after severing the bonds of sensual realm, practices to obtain freedom from passion, followed by either the mundane or supramundane path. This subsequently discusses 13 collections or equipment necessary to complete both paths, such as sensory restraint, controlling food intake. And the stage of deliverance continues over 2nd through 4th to provide the extended treatment of the Stravacca practice. The second, discusses the theoretical basis of the Stravacca practice in terms of persons, divided into 19 subsections on such subjects as the class of persons who cultivate the Stravacca path, meditative object, descriptions of various stages of concentration, samadhi, hindrances to meditation. The third, yoga sthana, concerns the preliminary practices performed by these persons, describing in detail the process of training. This is interesting because it's describing what might be thought of as early proto-Theravada. This process begins by first visiting the teacher. If the teacher identifies him as belonging to the Stravacca lineage, the practitioner that could then cultivate 5 ways. What are the 5 ways? 1, guarding and accumulating the requisites of samadhi. 2, selection. 3, one-pointedness of mind. 4, elimination of hindrances. 5, the cultivation of correct mental orientation. Among these 5, the section Karaka contains one of the most detailed discussions in Sanskrit sources of the meditative procedures for the cultivation of, yes, you've heard it, Samantha and Vipassana, Theravada practices. So Asanga's text has a detailed explanation in the 3rd, 4th century, long before Theravada writers like Buddha Agosha. And that's really interesting. You could compare the texts. The text continues. The practitioners accomplish the 5 stages of application. Overcoming the hindrances proceeds either to the mundane or the supramundane path. On the mundane path, the practitioner is said to be reborn into various heavens of, remember, the 6 realms, as it were, of supple material realm, the immaterial realm, and then beyond that, there are 31 planes of existence. By cultivating, this is from Buddha Agosha's, this is a century before Buddha Agosha, I should say. By cultivating the 4 subtle material meditative absorptions, some think Buddha Agosha stole this from, and Buddha Agosha didn't get all his ideas from reading the Abhidhamma, but rather he read it from here, or the 4 immaterial meditative absorptions, on the supramundane path, the Stravacca practices to attain the stage of worthy one by relying on the insight of what? The 4 noble truths. That is, and really will become central in Buddha Agosha's thinking in a century later. Remember, this is 4th century. This is Mahayana, describing what will be Theravada practice, influencing perhaps the 5th century Buddha Agosha. Now, what was Asanga's idea of the Prakya Buddha? Number 2. So we talked about number 1, the Stravacca Bhumi, in detail. Number 2 of 3, we haven't got to the Bodhisattva Bhumi, the Prakyana Buddha. All right, hold on to your hats. Number 2 of 3. Well, the first one isn't a good way. What about the second one? So the Prakyana Buddha Bhumi is a short section in this Yogacara Bhumi Sastra titled The Foundation on the Solitary Buddha, which outlines the disposition of the path and the practices of the Prakya Buddha. Cragg notes that the Prakya Buddha avoids crowds, takes pleasure in solitude, exhibits little compassion, that's key, and not inclined to teach others, and is of mediocre aptitude and has a temperament of pride. Ooh, look at the put down. That's interesting. Buswell says of the section, the next section, the Bodhisattva Bhumi, we'll get to in a second if I just missed a question. Let's do this. What was Sanga's idea of the Bodhisattva Bhumi? This is the one Asanga's going to root for, going to shout about. Well, Buswell says of this Bodhisattva Bhumi, that is the Bodhisattva Yana, the spiritual path of the Bodhisattva, is considered its third. It's to be superior. It's better than the Stravacca Bhumi and the Prakyana Bhumi. Because the Bodhisattva is designed to attain enlightenment by removing the Kelsayanas, the Varana, the intellectual afflictions, the Kelsas of the mind. Whereas those on the other two spiritual paths, aspire for nirvana, that is extinction of emotional afflictions only. Wow. So, the Bodhisattva is taking away the bad emotional, intellectual afflictions, whereas the other two are just aspiring to nirvana. Now, that's somewhat disingenuous, or is it? Certainly, later Theravada will say all three, and that's interesting. So to what extent is Rahula's exegetical claim that the inclusion of the Stravacca, the Prakyana, and the Bodhisattva Bhumi show all three yanas are given due consideration in the Mahayana? They're all given the same consideration? Really? Is there not an argument being made by a Sangha to say, yeah, there's some people doing this and some people have tried that, but number three, here's the best way, the Bodhisattva Yana way. Listen to what Rahula's saying here. This is a weak argument at best. He's not reading it properly. Just because a Sangha in his Yogacara Sutra considers the practice early Proto-Theravada Buddhist, he was polemically engaged with, he doesn't mean he considers them equal. Quite the opposite. The Sangha was in fact showing their limitations, particularly of the Prakya Buddha, who only has 8 bhumis, whereas the Bodhisattva Bhumi has 12 or sometimes 10.